Luce's issue at the start of the Owl House is, to me, fundamentally Freudian. Now, I don't want to scare you off with that kind of language, and I don't mean to imply Luce secretly yearns to have sex with her mother or father or something like that. No, I'm simply employing these Freudian ideas of the id and the superego to emblematize the journey that troubles Luce and that she must undertake. These tensions threaten to tear apart the possibility of any coherent sense of self, and it is only through navigating these tensions and exploring ways to resolve them and build a brighter future for herself, a future that reconciles her own personal passions with societal expectations and norms, is she able to move forward as a bearer of a more just and thoughtful society, of a future that cares for the benefit and well-being of all. The id, in case you're not familiar with Freudian terms, is pure passion, pure energy, pure force. It's what drives us to make impulsive choices that we might not make if we stepped back and thought about them a bit. But that doesn't mean the id is bad. It is love, attraction. It is what inspires us to want, to desire, and to go out and get that desire, to go out and try to achieve our ideals. It's the root of all values, all priorities, all strongly held feelings. There's nothing innately wrong with this. What's wrong is when it becomes overpowering. I think Luce struggles a bit from too much of this id force. At the start of the show, she does set snakes on everyone, might you remember, and she demonstrates little hesitation in leaving behind her old life, including her mom, in order to live with Ida, the Owl Lady, and King. Whether you agree with this decision or not, it is reckless and it is bold. It is Luce fulfilling her own volcanic passions. It is her prioritizing what will be immediately satisfying to her as opposed to societal expectations. Now, her going after these immediate desires is perhaps understandable, considering that she is under a lot of societal pressure and she feels isolated and alienated from society. Think about the superego. In Freudian psychology, the original force of authority, of enforcing norms and standards of behavior, is the father figure. But as society evolves and grows, instead of a single patriarch enforcing authority, that responsibility is spread to societal structures as a whole. Now, like with the id, there is nothing wrong with the superego. Freud rightly emphasizes that if there was no superego, society could hardly develop. People would have no ability to restrain themselves. They would have no ability to check their impulses in deference to the values of a larger society. Perhaps some would, but most wouldn't. Keeping people from prioritizing these instant passions, from going after whatever lusts or volcanic desires are erupting in them, is a positive. You don't want someone saying, oh hey, I want that piece of gold, and being willing to lie, cheat, and steal to take it. But the superego's pressure can also become overwhelming. It can cause us to become disassociated from our desires, to view them as a source of guilt and a source of shame. This is a problem not just because that position is too extreme, but, as Freud emphasizes in Civilization and its Discontents, this does not actually cause these passions to go away. It doesn't make these less socially acceptable desires cease to be. It simply buries them deeper within ourselves, causes us to feel bad about them, and thus generates a lot of malaise overall. So Luce is struggling between her overexpressive id, which is perhaps a little stronger in her as she is a creative person, and the dispassionate, cold, rather heartless superego of an uncaring society that wants to enforce norms. And she has to try to integrate these two parts of herself. This is what I believe her journey is about, and I believe she manages to do this. She does indeed become less selfish. She does indeed grow up. She becomes more attentive to the well-beings of others. She becomes more willing to defer or even sacrifice her own caprices in order to pledge herself to a higher ideal, and yet she manages to do this without smothering her own creativity, her own imagination, her own desire. And it is important that doing this is a process for Luce. It's a long process and a hard process. It is not a simple, easy lesson that she can learn on an episode of the day talking about a specific moral, a specific precept that she must internalize. I've been reading a lot of Hegel recently. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is a very, very difficult and often tedious book, but it's fascinating in how it describes the need to, on one hand, go beyond mere sensory experience, and on the other hand, go beyond mere abstractions. If you rely merely on sensory experience, your frame of reference is ultimately limited, and you can't ascend to higher ideals. And if you instead start with those ideals, they become abstract. They lose all real color or substance and become mere platitudes that have no bearing on how we actually experience the world. So, Hegel says the challenge is to navigate from the sensory, the merely immediate, to the abstract, to these grand experiences, and ultimately come to the conclusion that these are not opposite. Through our experience, we understand these two, we experience these two as being part of the same organic whole. And this is ultimately, in a different way, what Luce is accomplishing. She can't say, oh hey, my creative side is something that needs to be reined in, because where she is now, she would take that as a complete devastation of her basic sense of being. And she can't take it merely as the simplistic platitude of, oh hey, society is 100% wrong, because that's oversimplistic too, and that doesn't offer her any solutions on how to move forward. But rather, she navigates between these two extremes through a series of experiences that allow her to recognize the flaws in her initial perception of the world. They teach her that her reliance on her immediate id, her immediate passions, is ultimately unreliable, and yet that there is also something necessary and important in those passions, and she has to act on her own experiences to come up with a way to maintain a link to those passions while ultimately not merely being a prisoner of them. This is a very different view than the silly think inside the box camp that we get in episode 1. Obviously, something like that is wrong because it's conformist and anti-individualist, but it's also wrong because it's oversimplistic, because it implies that you can just force an abstract ideal on someone and shape them through such blunt and overly dogmatic methods. You can do that, of course, but not without causing a lot of suffering, and not without still causing the person to not integrate those ideals into their basic organic sense of the self. They will forever view what they see as an attack on their individuality and creativity as a kind of oppression, as a kind of restriction. It's not a healthy way to go about life. It's quite similar to what Freud says about the superego. There's nothing wrong with pressures toward an abstract ideal, but when they come at the expense of causing someone to be disassociated from their real individual experiences, what that causes is a fundamental sense of psychological malaise and dissatisfaction. So how does Luce do this? Well, for her, it's related to community. She also learns to navigate above the binary between the individual and the community. Accepting a larger sense of community, a larger sense of family, causes her to understand herself better and be able to balance these two different, seemingly opposing needs that she sees. The need to both be true to her own imagination and creativity and transcend her own selfish, juvenile impulses and act in a more heroic and selfless way. A way that benefits others and not just herself. Community is very important to the Owl House. The isolated, lonely individual has a difficult time finding any semblance of order or sense or clarity in their lives. Look at Hunter, who is completely lost until he manages to latch onto a greater sense of community. People who will support him while also leading him in the right direction. Even someone like the Collector, this image of the ultimate id, the ultimate wellspring of uncontrolled impulses, manages to moderate his own passions and caprices through his own adventures and through learning from people like Luce, through developing a larger perspective and a larger sense of understanding outside his necessarily limited individual viewpoint. The one exception to the Owl House's emphasis on community is Belos, who emphatically chooses loneliness and refuses community and only associates with others in a megalomaniacal, obsessive way. He wants to conquer and destroy. Luce ultimately relies and depends on that sense of community. It does not lead her directly to make any specific decisions. She needs to have her own experiences and come to her own conclusions. It needs to be organic, this uniting of the id and the superego. But she needs the comfort and the guidance offered by people like Ida and people like Camilla, her own mom, in order to be able to go on that quest, to not be so scared and so filled with shame, to have the sense of comfort and openness, to indulge her own curious impulses, to inspect her own self, her own values and viewpoints, both to validate her own imagination and her own creativity and to see the ways in which she can improve. This open and creative exploration would not be possible without the benefit of a larger sense of community. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. I would say keep watching The Owl House, but it's over now. Well, go back and rewatch it. The show is great. Not perfect, but no show is. But The Owl House is one of the most consistent and most thoughtful and compelling animated shows directed at a younger audience that I've seen in quite a long time, and it deserves a lot of appreciation for that. So anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon, that I promise you. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.